Hi everyone, and welcome to our lecture on process tracing. So for today, we're going to be talking about the 4 causal hurdles, which you might recall from a few weeks ago. We're going to get into what is process tracing, because process tracing helps us clear a couple of those causal hurdles. We're going to talk about process tracing in your reading from Furman. And then finally, we're going to talk about what would need to appear in your own research design, including an example. So just if you recall where we are in the whole research design section, in week 8, we were talking about case selection. So whether you should do comparative case studies, single case studies, or correlational analyses. Then section 2, we are talking about variable measurement. So you had one lecture in week 8 on how to get data, what appropriate data might be. And that included week 9 lectures as well, where we talked about content analysis, for instance. And then this week, we're talking about this last section, methodology for causal inference, including data sources. Okay, specifically process tracing. So when we, if you recall from a few weeks ago, we talked about those 4 causal hurdles. So the first one is hurdle 1, a good theory. And you all have submitted a good theory at this point, right? You gave me a convincing story that connects X to Y. Hurdle 2 is correlation. Are your independent and dependent variables correlated with one another? And that's what you assess in your results section. But just because something is correlated doesn't mean that there is causation. And so that is where we are today, right? How do you prove causation, particularly with case studies? So we have a couple of methods here, or we have one method with a couple of steps. So step 1, assess whether there is correlation between your independent and dependent variable. So independent variable is X and dependent variable is Y. So how you clear causal hurdle 2, that correlation, right? You won't actually check for correlation in your research design section. That comes later. That will appear in your results section, but you need to say in your research design section that you are going to be checking for correlation, that you are going to be testing for correlation. So in your research design, it should say, I am testing for correlation between my independent variable and dependent variable. Okay, your reading for today is the Furman reading, which we keep referring back to. And they have here, they're examining India and Pakistan. And if you recall, Furman argues that civilian nuclear cooperation agreements will ultimately lead to nuclear weapons programs starting. And that's because when countries have these civilian nuclear cooperation agreements, which start to cultivate the knowledge and expertise among engineers and scientists in nuclear energy generally, that expertise can then later on transfer over into nuclear weapons because it reduces the costs to start up these nuclear weapons programs, right? Just because they're not trained explicitly on nuclear weapons, instead they're trained on nuclear energy or something adjacent, that can then shift over to nuclear weapons. And that is what Furman's argument is here. But just because these are correlated doesn't mean, right, even though we see that India and Pakistan, yes, developed the human capital and the expertise to do this, and then later on they have nuclear weapons programs, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's causal, right? That's still just a correlation. There are lots of instances of things that are correlated. If you remember from our lecture a few weeks ago, Nicolas Cage movies and the number of drowning deaths. Just because something is correlated doesn't mean that it is causal. And so that's what we're trying to do here is how do we prove causality? And that's where this next step comes in with process tracing, where you're trying to ascertain whether your X or independent variable really caused your dependent variable. So process tracing is the systematic examination of diagnostic evidence selected and analyzed in light of research questions and hypotheses posed by the investigator. And this is how you are going to clear causal hurdles 3 and 4. Okay, so this relies on, I know that this definition here is a bit vague, but it relies on evidence in narrative form. So interviews, archival records, memoirs, biographies, maybe even government reports, and takes narrative evidence, so statements that people have made who are involved in the process, and connects X and Y, okay? Ultimately, you should be exploring whether there is narrative evidence to support the notion that X caused Y. Not that X is correlated with Y, but that X causes Y. And I'll show you an example in a second. But first, let's think about the Louvre jewel heist, right? Most recently, we saw $100 million worth of jewels stolen from a pretty prominent French museum. And let's say we find those jewels in someone's apartment. Does that mean that the people who resided in that apartment stole the jewels? No, right? Like someone could have placed them there who doesn't reside in the apartment. Maybe the people in the apartment bought them not knowing that they were the stolen jewels. They did. In other words, that's correlation. Just because something appears in a place, in an apartment, doesn't mean that the individuals who reside in the apartment are necessarily the criminals. And so what kind of narrative evidence would we be looking for to connect maybe the people who lived in the apartment with the jewels? Most obviously, you would maybe look for a confession from the people who lived in the apartment that they did it, right? Like yes, it was us. But you might also rely on testimony from people who were at the museum when the crime was committed. You might look through those individuals who reside in the apartment, their text messages or conversations that they had with people in the previous weeks. That's narrative evidence that they might have, like maybe they literally have text messages that are like, see you at 1 p.m. to rob the jewels, right? You might also even take expert testimony from maybe this detective here who found that the fingerprints near the jewelry match fingerprints in the apartment. Something like that. In other words, you are looking for narrative evidence from individuals involved, from experts, maybe from witnesses that really connect X and Y, right? That really connect these individuals to the outcome. Okay, so what are you going to specifically be looking for? So in particular, what kind of statements and language would demonstrate that X causes Y? So you'll want to be looking for statements by individuals and groups discussed in your theory. So is your theory about how individuals vote? Then you're probably going to want to have statements from like individual voters. If your statement is about elites and how they behave in terms of roll call votes, you're going to want to interview members of Congress. So here you need to do the actors relevant to your theory suggest that they were influenced in some capacity by your independent variable. But be aware that sometimes, even though there is narrative evidence, that there are still limitations to that, right? Ask yourself if a person or member of Congress or elected official or voter has a reason to be truthful or untruthful, right? There can be biases within people, and that doesn't even necessarily mean that they're intending to be untruthful, right? They might just assume that this is how the world works, that X does cause Y. In any case, though, you are looking for statements from relevant actors in your theory, and I'll give you an example here. So let's say that my theory is that an increase in campaign donations to a member of Congress causes an increase in the chances that this politician will be elected. And there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that the more money you have, the more likely you are to get reelected. So our independent variable is the level of campaign donations to a given member of Congress. And then our dependent variable is whether a member of Congress wins reelection Yes or no. Okay. So what types of statements and available language would demonstrate that X causes Y? Again, I'd ask you, let's go back to our theory, right? What relevant actors are involved in a member of Congress's re-election or election campaign? Okay, so what types of statements and other available language would demonstrate this? So maybe we look at members of Congress themselves, and like we see if they say that campaign donations are essential to win re-election. And we could imagine that this is quite intuitive. You can take those campaign donations and put them directly into get out the vote campaigns and ads on TV, on radio, on TikTok, right? You might also think about campaigns are not just run by the member of Congress, they're also oftentimes run by staffers. So do staffers think that working for a member of Congress says something to that effect? And then finally, does the challenger, right? Does the person that they're competing against say that campaign donations are important, are pivotal to the success or perhaps failure of their campaign? So again, what you do is you ask yourself, who is pivotal to my theory? What actors are pivotal to my theory and hypothesis? And then you ask yourself, what statements would I be looking for if my hypothesis were correct from these actors, okay? So where can you look for these kinds of statements for process tracing? So unlike your literature review, where they have to be peer-reviewed journal articles, these could be in newspaper reports, these could be in biographies, autobiographies, memoirs. They're oftentimes in interviews of some kind, but you can also have sources for process tracing from things like policy documents, strategy papers, and academic journal articles. But be aware that you are not using the conclusions of other scholarly sources like peer-reviewed articles, but you are using their unprocessed or raw information. So if someone else maybe has some quotes from a survey that they did, you can also use those quotes if they support your conclusion, but you can't take their conclusions from their article and say, look, I found support because this is what McBrayer found here. No, because that was processed. I processed that. That was my conclusion. You need to use their sort of raw data instead. Now, I want to just show you quickly the example from Furman, which you read for this week. So just if you recall, Furman is arguing that countries with nuclear cooperation agreements cause countries to build nuclear weapons, okay? And the reason for this is that it reduces the expected costs of a weapons program, making it more likely that a decision to begin such a program will be made, okay? And so this quote at the end, I think, is quite illustrative. As Stephen Meyer argues, when the financial and resource demands of beginning a weapons program become less burdensome because they have developed nuclear expertise when it comes to energy, states might opt to proceed under a balance of incentives and disincentives that traditionally might have been perceived as insufficient for a proliferation decision. So in other words, this is the hypothesis, right? Countries that have nuclear cooperation agreements will be more likely to adopt nuclear weapons programs. Okay, and so in Furman, the two cases that they look at for today in terms of process tracing are India and Pakistan. Okay, and so in 1955, India built its first research reactor using British supplied designs. This facility, known as the Aspara Research Reactor, became operational in 1956 using enriched uranium fuel, also supplied by the UK. In 1956, Canada agreed to supply India with a 40 megawatt research reactor known as the Canada-India-United States Research Reactor, which really rolls off the tongue. In any case, though, this is evidence of like, look, they have a nuclear cooperation agreement, right? Like they're working with the British and Canada and the United States to develop nuclear energy, nuclear engineering. Okay, so this is the background on India. We're not to the process tracing just yet, but they say eventually this will lead to nuclear weapons in India. So as you can see here, this is from Baba. Baba, this would be considered the process tracing. Baba expressed a similar opinion in January 1964. When he indicated that, quote, any knowledge of operating a reactor for peaceful purposes can be employed later for operating a reactor for military purposes. Bingo, right? Like Baba is saying it directly. And you'll note too that these are our two footnotes here. So in September, Baba, the chairman of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, argued that countries can easily use know-how and experiences obtained through peaceful programs. Okay. And then this is where we got that from, that sort of narrative evidence. Okay. But the thing about it is that Shastri, who is the prime minister at the time, is pretty opposed to the prospect of developing nuclear weapons. So it says here, Shastri was highly sensitive to the expected costs of a program because India faced economic hardship and massive food shortages during his tenure. He was initially reluctant to initiate a weapons program because this would force New Delhi to abandon plans for economic development and divert substantial resources away from other domestic programs. These sentiments are captured here with this quote from the Statesman. Both bomb production and effective delivery could be secured if the price is paid for it in terms of economic deprivation, but no responsible person has suggested that the object is worth that price. Right? Like that's pretty significant. He's saying, look, we can't do both, have economic development programs and nuclear weapons. If we pursue nuclear weapons, it's going to be at the expense of our people and these domestic programs, particularly with respect to poverty and food. Okay, so this is Shastri's reservation here, and you can see the citations down here. But Baba is successfully lobbying Shastri. In October 1964, Baba proclaimed that India could acquire a nuclear bomb within 18 months of a political decision to develop it, and that a 10 kiloton blast would cost only $350,000. Okay, so in other words, Baba's like, don't worry, it's not going to be that much because we've already developed some of these skills and capacities. And ultimately, eventually, Baba convinced Shastri that a bomb could be built relatively quickly without diverting substantial resources away from development programs. This argument was especially compelling because the country's rivalry with China provided strategic incentives to build the bomb. In other words, this successfully clears hurdles 3 and 4 because it's proving, like with narrative evidence from India, that between Baba and Shastri, that Baba successfully lobbies Shastri to ultimately invest in a nuclear weapons program because they already have the necessary expertise that makes it not super costly to pursue. Okay, we also see this exam in Pakistan. So Khan says this, I have no place from which to draw talented scientists and engineers to work in our nuclear establishment. This is a direct quote from him. We don't have a training system for the kind of cadres we need. But if we can get France or somebody else to come and create a broad nuclear infrastructure and build these plants and these laboratories, I will train hundreds of my people in ways that otherwise they would never be able to be trained. And with that training and with the blueprints and the other things that we'd get along the way, then we could set up separate plants that would not be under safeguards, that would not be built with direct foreign assistance. But I would not have the people who could do that. If I don't get the cooperation, I can't train the people to run a weapons program. So that's from Khan. Mubarak Khan, who is also from the Pakistan case, says he heads the team of scientists that orchestrated the nuclear tests. He suggests that any country can procure dual-use equipment relative to a weapons program, but states cannot build the bomb unless there is a human resource available, which understands nuclear-related work to such an extent that it is able to develop and raise this program from 0 to 100% all by itself. So Pakistan is similar. They need the human resources, the human expertise to develop nuclear weapons programs, but they instead start getting this sort of knowledge and expertise from other countries, and then they can translate it over to nuclear weapons. So this is, again, for Pakistan, clearing those hurdles 3 and 4, because yes, they have civilian nuclear cooperation agreements, and they do develop nuclear weapons, but is that correlation sufficient? Probably not. But this process tracing illustrates that for both India and Pakistan, these narrative statements illustrate that yes, the people involved, including people like prime ministers and directors of relevant committees, are saying like, yes, you have to have the human expertise through civilian nuclear cooperation agreements in order to ultimately develop nuclear weapons. But what you have just seen are the results of process tracing, okay? This is not what needs to appear in your research design. Your research design is the plan for your process tracing, and I'll show you what elements are needed, and then I'll give you an example. So in your process tracing, you need to have a brief discussion of how you're going to assess whether your independent and dependent variables are correlated in the way your hypothesis predicts. There needs to be a discussion of how exactly you're going to perform process tracing. So what types of statements are you going to look for? What types of statements and by whom would provide evidence for your hypothesis? And then finally, what sources are you going to consult to look for this evidence? So you want to be precise here. It's okay. You don't get any extra points if you do or don't find any evidence from process tracing. But you do need to tell me what you are going to be looking for. It's okay if you end up finding no evidence for a causal link between X and Y. But this is an example from our undergraduate research journal, which I'll post a couple of examples from there for both a quantitative and a qualitative research design. So it says here, process tracing will be conducted by retrieving statements regarding the commissions and differences in democratic values in my cases. I am looking for statements that indicate my hypothesis is correct and there is a causal linkage between truth and justice processes and proliferation of democratic values. I will look at statements from politicians, actors involved in this process, military officials, and civil society groups about the impact that these commissions had on their respective societies. If actors state that a strong truth and justice process has made democracy stronger, and inversely statements that link a weak process to issues with modern democracy, my hypothesis is correct. So you can see these first 2 sentences are talking about, like, I'm going to be doing process tracing, and I'm looking for statements that support my hypothesis, that there's a causal linkage between truth and justice processes and proliferation of democratic values. And then the author says, these are the kinds of actors I'm going to be looking at, statements from them, politicians, military officials, civil society groups. And the kinds of statements I'm looking for are both strong truth and justice processes, or that they have made democracy stronger, and then also the inverse as well. But this is what we would like to see when you talk about process tracing in your research design. Now, what we covered for today, we talked about the 4 causal hurdles, what is process tracing in Furman specifically, and then how to do it in your own research design.